TikTok stuff. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, Son is doing the conference. I did want to promote that, but for right now, I'm not going to be taking any guests as I talk about this because there's a lot of stuff that I want to go through and deal with. If you find any of my stuff useful and you want to show a little appreciation for it, my Cash App is down there. My Venmo is actually going to help me move. I'm moving from Arkansas to Minnesota next month. And so any monies given to the Venmo will be going to the moving and relocation fees. Also, there's a GoFundMe. You can find it in all my links. I also want to let you know that many of the talking points that I'm going to draw out today, I actually included the links to those sources in my document. You can subscribe to that. Also, in all my links, $5 a month will get you access to all of the links that I use in talking about news stories during regular shows, but also you're going to get the links to this show where I'm talking about this issue. Now, let's get down to the topic. Recently, there has been a growth in the focus on the correlation of specifically autism, but also anxiety and depression. Now, these issues are not new. The discussion of depression and anxiety and even autism in relation to people who experience a transgender identity, this is not new. This data has been around for a decade. We know all of this data. We've seen all of this data, but right now it seems like it's become much more interesting to talk about this because what we are seeing is the information that is being drawn from is used to put a barrier to gender affirming care for transgender youth and adults. So, as we talk about the movement of diagnosis, sort of the idea of what it takes to be diagnosed with anxiety, what it takes to be diagnosed with depression, and in particular, neurodiverse experiences such as ADHD and autism. As we talk about those diagnoses, there are some members of those connections who happen to be transgender people. And as we kind of dig into some of this, you're going to see that the numbers are noticeable. So I want to go back to a very early, and by early, I mean 2015. This is from the International Review of Psychiatry. The introduction says, the core features of autism spectrum disorder are problems in social communication and interaction together with repetitive behavior and specific interests. Autism spectrum disorder reflects different heterogeneous clinical subtypes formally described as specific diagnostic entities such as Asperger's in the DSM-4. In the DSM-5, a more dimensional perspective is used with one ASD classification that can be specified according to the manner of its presentation. A review of the literature showed that the prevalence of ASD in the general population seems to be increasing and is now estimated at 1% in the most recent studies, and that was in 2014. It is uncertain whether there is true increase or whether higher rates are due to improved methods of detecting ASD. Additionally, in terms of etiology, complex interactions between known and unknown genetic predispositions and non-genetic risk factors may lead to development of ASD. Again, 2014. When it comes to gender dysphoria, this same article says, independent from ASD, the term gender dysphoria is used in the DSM-5 to denote distress resulting from the incongruence between one's experienced gender and one's assigned gender, together with a persistent and strong desire to be of another gender. In the DSM-4, gender identity disorder was used as terminology, and earlier versions of transsexualism going back before that. As different forms of terminology exist in the literature, in the current article, we use the most recent term described in the DSM-5, gender dysphoria, when individuals have an official diagnosis. Feelings of gender dysphoria will be used as broader terminology when an official diagnosis is not applicable, but gender nonconformity is meant more broadly. For people with the official diagnosis, the prevalence of gender dysphoria in adults is estimated to be in the range of 1 in every 10,000 to 1 in every 20,000 male identified at birth individuals, and then a range of 1 in 30,000 to 1 in 50,000 for female identified at birth persons. Now that is from a 2009 study. Just like the prevalence of ASD, an increase of the gender dysphoria prevalence is reported over time, and gender identity clinics consequently report an increase in referrals according to 2014. It is unclear whether this reflects true increase or whether it reflects the fact that it has become much easier to seek transgender care due to more visibility and acceptance. It should not be assumed that an increase in incidence is linked to any one cause, as any single cause of gender dysphoria being unlikely, but an interaction of biological, social, and psychological factors. A multifactorial etiology is most likely. All right? So, what we're talking about is that gender dysphoria is not something that you can just plop down and say, oh, there's been a growth in it because there's a trend. There's been an outburst, an explosion of this due to social contagion. Those are the prominent themes in anti-trans discussions. That it's either a trend or that it is social contagion. Now, where these two come together. ASD is associated with several comorbid disorders, including affective disorders and attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. There is growing interest in co-occurring gender dysphoria and ASD, which is reflected by an increasing number of recently published case reports and empirical quantitative studies. See Skagerberg 2015, Tatino in 2015. Indeed, clinically it is recognized that the co-occurrence of gender dysphoria and ASD challenges the existing diagnostic and treatment guidelines that exist for transgender individuals. At present, specific advice for individuals presenting with co-occurring gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder is unavailable, and knowledge about underlying hypotheses concerning this link is very limited. Now, this article is from 2015. It is, it's talking about this issue all the way, we're talking, 8 years ago. We're talking about information that was already being researched back in the 2000s. This information is not brand new. It is not, this is not something that is just now being dropped in the laps of people. We've known about this. We have known about the possibility that there is a co-occurrence, as the language uses it, not a comorbidity. The co-occurrence of gender dysphoria with autism spectrum disorder is not new. So when we see doctors, when we see lawyers, when we see politicians using the language of comorbidity, they are actually ignoring the terms that are used in the scientific data. The scientific research looks at those two things as co-occurring. They are a part of a neurodiverse understanding of human makeup, but they are not considered to be in any way pathologically interfering with one another. Now, from 2017, the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry issued this article: Gender dysphoria, in quotes, and autism spectrum disorder. Is the link real? The abstract says this: the topic of gender identity in children and adolescents has gained widespread attention in Western society during the past decade, from news media to legislative agendas and popular television. Simultaneously, there have been more referrals to pediatric gender clinics, an increase in the number of pediatric gender clinics, and a surge in research related to pediatric gender identity. More recently, growing attention has been paid to a putative relation between gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder. This concept has become particularly popular in the lay press. Some individuals have gone so far to suggest that transgender identity is a result of underlying psychopathology, with autism spectrum disorder being one example. These conclusions are not supported by extant research, and practicing child and adolescent psychiatrists should be aware of the literature on this topic and its limitations. So you have the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry saying that even 2 years after the previous article, lay literature, the press that is not related to scientific research and data and information, the lay press was already making the claim that there was a pathological connection between gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder. This offers a warning. This offers a message of, look, if you're a professional, you do need to be aware of this. You need to be aware of these comments that are being made. Why? Because we're talking about child and adolescent psychiatry. We're going, this article is saying we as professionals are going to experience parents, family members coming into our offices talking about our kids, and they have only read the lay press. They have only read of this pathologizing information. They have not read the data that says that it is a co-occurrence, not comorbidity. From Science Direct, the article Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders from January of 2020, this article, Autism and Transgender Identity, Implications for Depression and Anxiety. In the introduction, it says this: autism diagnosis and autistic traits are more common in the transgender population than in the wider cisgender population. This is according to a 2010 study. However, this overlap is not well understood nor appreciated. Gatekeeping of mental health and transition-related services is a major issue for the transgender community, and particularly for those with autism, according to Strang, 2018. This is exemplified by a number of high-profile cases involving autistic transgender individuals and transgender individuals with other developmental disorders or mental health conditions who have faced numerous roadblocks when seeking transition-related care, according to White, 2016. Better understanding of the needs of autistic individuals who identify as transgender is therefore of crucial importance. This article is stating that they are aware that these issues are now becoming barriers, that somebody who has a type of autistic behavior is, that is now creating a barrier to gender affirming care. Again, this is 2020. This is not today. Anecdotally, clinicians and those involved in the trans and autistic communities have noted overlap between autism and gender variance. Case studies have identified this both in children and in adults, sex assigned male and female at birth. Consistently, studies investigating the incidence of autistic traits and autism diagnosis in individuals referred to gender identity clinics suggest that autistic traits are higher in those who are gender variant than in cisgender populations. In a sample of children and adolescents, wait a minute, hang on, I skipped a line there. For example, DeVries in 2010 observed that the incidence of autism diagnosis confirmed using a diagnostic interview for social and communication disorders in a sample of children and adolescents was 7.8%, around 10 times higher than the 0.6% to 1% prevalence in the general population. So there is a 7.8% diagnosis compared to a 0.6 to 1%. So 7.8 within transgender identified individuals versus 1% in cisgender individuals. And we're talking about children and adolescents at this point. In adults referred to gender identity clinics, Pasterky, Gilligan, and Curtis in 2014 also observed that the prevalence of clinically significant autistic traits confirmed using autism spectrum quotient was 5.5%. A number of other studies have reported a greater incidence of autistic traits in adolescents and children identified as gender dysphoric, such as Skagerberg, DeSegli, and Carmichael 2015, Vanderlaan, Leaf, Wood, Hughes, and Zucker 2015. With recent research reporting an even higher prevalence of autistic traits in gender dysphoric children, about 26%, Katiala, Hino, Sumia, and Tiolojarvi and Lindbergh 2015, Schumer, Reisner, Edwards, Leeper, and Tishelman in 2016, Vandermeesen, Hurley, Ball, and DeVries in 2018, Vandermeesen and DeVries, Steensman, and Hartman in 2018. So that number of 7.8 moves now closer to 26%. Despite consistent evidence, it is noticeable that in these studies, the incidence of autistic traits was assessed among gender dysphoric individuals. Whilst a perfectly valid method, this recruitment strategy is likely to exclude trans individuals who have not been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and given known difficulties accessing gender identity clinics, National Health Services England 2015, may limit our understanding of the overlap between transgender identity and autism more broadly. More recent studies have therefore begun to examine gender variance in autistic individuals, or the overlap between autism and gender variance in large internet samples. Consistent with research assessing autistic traits in gender variant samples, these studies suggest that the incidence of trans identity is higher in children with a diagnosis of autism than children with ADHD or neurodevelopmental disorders such as epilepsy or neurofibromatosis, or typically developing children. While much research is focused on the overlap between trans identity and autism, to our knowledge, there's been little research on the impact of this overlap on mental health. However, there's reason to believe this overlap may confer an increased risk of common mental health problems such as depression and anxiety. Numerous studies report higher rates of depression and anxiety in trans population than in the general population or even the LGB population. Similarly, depression and anxiety are the most common comorbidities in autism. So, in both transgender communities and in the autistic identified communities, depression and anxiety show an increased level over those who are not identified in either of those categories. Um, this study examined the overlap between trans identity and autism in a large sample of adults using an online questionnaire assessing autistic traits, gender identity, depression, and anxiety. Previous studies investigating the overlap between autism and trans identity have mostly focused on children and adolescents, with much research conducted in gender identity clinics assessing rates of autism among gender dysphoric children. This is problematic because it conflates trans identity with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria and therefore fails to consider trans individuals without a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Trans individuals may not have a gender dysphoria diagnosis due to difficulties accessing gender identity clinics or because they do not feel free they do not feel clinically significant levels of distress that would require medical attention. As such, we examine the overlap between autism and trans identity defined by the individuals themselves. So that is the, that is the scope of this research. The overlap that they found between trans identity and autism was significant. Within the sample not reporting a diagnosis of autism, 566 individuals identified as cis and 99 individuals identified as trans. Within the sample reporting a diagnosis of autism, 37 identified as cis, 25 identified as trans. They went on to study the impact of autism and trans identity on depression and anxiety. And while the attention was to assess the impact of autism diagnosis, gender identity, and sex assigned at birth on mental health outcomes, this was not possible as group numbers were too low. Given that trans men and trans women did not differ in terms of depression and anxiety, these groups were combined. We therefore examined the impact of autism and trans identity on depression and anxiety using a 2x2 robust ANOVA for depression and anxiety separately. For depression scores, the main effect of autism was observed, whereby depression scores were higher in individuals reporting diagnosis of autism. A main effect on gender identity was also observed, whereby individuals identifying as trans had higher rates of depression than those identified as cis. No interaction between gender identity or autism diagnosis on depression scores was observed, indicating no super additive effect of gender identity and autism diagnosis on depression. Similar scores were found for anxiety. I will be honest, no, I don't. I am referring to this article. So if you would like to inform the class what ANOVA is, please do. I'm not an expert. I am sharing articles. I am sharing journal pieces. Hi, Witchy. The study that I'm talking about was looking at the overlap between gender identity and autism. Okay, son, come up and explain what ANOVA is.
So, ANOVA is a statistical method in which two groups are compared for their statistical mean and various other statistical variables. And it also compares the variation within one group. So variation between two groups and variation within one group. So that's why it's a very strong statistical indicator.
Yeah. And the comment that I made was, we therefore examine the impact of autism and trans identity on depression and anxiety using a 2x2 robust ANOVA for depression and anxiety separately.
Mm-hmm.
In autism, in the autism categories, it was diagnosis versus no diagnosis. In the gender identity category, it was trans versus cis.
Yeah, so you would be comparing the variation between trans and cis and between undiagnosed and diagnosed, and the variance between undiagnosed and cis, undiagnosed and trans, diagnosed and cis, diagnosed and trans.
All right. Thank you very much for explaining that.
Yep.
So the study the overlap between gender identity and autism and the impact of any observed overlap on mental health. Consistent with previous studies, we found significant overlap between autism and trans identity. Compared to cis individuals, autistic traits were higher in those identifying as trans. These findings provide further support for this overlap not just being present in children and adolescents, but also extending into adulthood. Building on studies focusing on rates of autism in those referred to gender identity clinics, these data provide evidence that individuals who self-identify as transgender display more autistic traits than cisgender individuals. Importantly, the finding that autistic traits are higher in trans individuals who do not report a diagnosis of autism suggests that trans individuals without a diagnosis of autism, either because they have not been able to access one or because they don't fulfill the diagnostic criteria, also display more autistic traits than cis individuals. Now, the reason why I'm talking about all of this is that this information is not brand new. This was from 2020. It was accessing and quoting research from up to 5 years prior. So back to 2015, there has been this examination of some form of relationship or co-occurrence, as the original article stated, a co-occurrence of gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder. We are not talking about the fact that everyone who is trans is autistic, and we're not saying that everyone who is autistic is trans. That's not what's being discussed here. What is being discussed is this co-occurrence. All right? Another article from Nature Communications, elevated rates of autism, other neurodevelopmental and psychiatric diagnoses, and autistic traits in transgender and gender diverse individuals. This is from August of 2020. From Spectrum. This is September of 2020. Just an article. People who do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth are 3 to 6 times as likely to be autistic as cisgender people are, according to the largest study yet to examine the connection. And this is in reference to the study that I just referenced in Nature Communication. This is the article that sounds like it is the most recent and addressed in terms of the statistics that we are seeing. Um, hang on here. The tie-in with this is going to happen. You just have to be patient and listen to everything else. If you cannot listen to everything that is being said, then you are just wanting to cherry pick information. What I'm talking about has a direct correlation to this subject matter. So, hold your hats, sit down, and listen. Now, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network brings us up to date because as of March 22nd, they were talking about the Georgia bill, SB 140, and the Missouri Attorney General's emergency regulation. As we are looking at all of this data that has been played out over time for the last at least 8 years, this talk about a co-occurrence of gender dysphoria and autistic spectrum disorder, these things are not a new conversation. They have been in the scientific community for some time now. We've been talking about it. My circle has been talking about this. You know, my friend Mama Pistachio, who is on this app and is co-founder of the Umbrella Alliance, we talk about this on a regular basis, that there is this co-occurrence between autistic traits and gender dysphoric experience. In terms of that, you know, there's this overlap that has been noted 3 to 6 times in trans communities than what we see in cis communities. We've established this fact that there is a co-occurrence of gender dysphoria with autistic traits. Now, that number has now been used by politicians to create a barrier to gender affirming care. Case in point. Senate Bill 140 in Georgia states at the very beginning and the outline of this bill, there has been a massive unexplained rise in diagnoses of gender dysphoria among children over the past 10 years, with most of those experiencing this phenomenon being girls. Gender dysphoria is often comorbid with other mental health and developmental conditions, including autism spectrum disorder. Those two statements right there set us up for the conversation that we are looking at bills that are referencing data and not using it in good faith. In none of the data that I have shared with you is gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder ever considered to be a comorbidity of one another. They are co-occurring, and both of them have comorbidities with depression and anxiety. Both of them, both diagnoses, gender dysphoria, autistic spectrum disorder, exist with comorbidities of depression and anxiety themselves. What we then see is that this is overlapping. Gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder overlap, and therefore the depression and anxiety comorbidities are sort of overlapping as well. Just because being trans and being autistic may have a link, that does not mean that they are pathologically connected. Politicians are not doing that. Politicians are making that connection that no scientists have made. Politicians are creating a pathological causation between autism and gender dysphoria. They are implying that autism causes gender dysphoria, and therefore by treating autism, you then deal with gender dysphoria. That brings us to the Missouri Attorney General. In an emergency order from the Attorney General of Missouri, let me find the right place in this. Individuals of any age experiencing gender dysphoria or related conditions should be able to and are able to obtain care in Missouri. Often this care takes the form of psychotherapy, also known as talk therapy, rather than any chemical or surgical intervention. In recent years, the use of other forms of intervention, often without any talk therapy at all, has accelerated exponentially. This emergency rule is necessary to protect the public health, safety, and welfare, and also to protect a compelling and governmental interest, as the Attorney General is charged with protecting consumers, including minors, from harm and investigating fraud and abuse in the state's health care payment system. The Attorney General finds that this emergency action is needed because of a compelling governmental interest and a need to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. Now, in the midst of this action, the Attorney General of Missouri made these statements. There's a lot to this, so I'm trying to find. All right, so the Attorney General of Missouri created this diagnostic criteria. Medical professionals and services must ensure that the patient has received a comprehensive screening to determine whether a patient has autism. They also must ensure that any psychiatric symptoms from existing mental health comorbidities of the patient have been treated and resolved. In that statement, when we are talking about the comorbidities within mental health experience, the Attorney General is leaving a gap in that space and almost provides the linkage for anyone to make that he is saying that autism is a mental health comorbidity that must be treated and resolved. Now, there are certain members of the autistic community who do believe that autism needs to be treated, that behaviors can be taught to decrease the symptomatic observability of autistic traits. There are others within the autistic community who believe that doing that is harmful to the experience of an autistic person. Someone who experiences autism does not need to change their behavior in order to hide their observable diagnosis. When we talk about autistic traits, many times there are things that make them awkward within society. There are things that make them more challenging to, people who like to think of themselves as normal to accept. As an individual with autistic traits, I can tell you that there have been times when people around me are like, I don't get you. And mine are very minor. But when we talk about autism as an experience, it is not a mental health issue that needs to be treated and resolved. Autism is a form of neurodiversity. It is a form of neurological development. It is a way in which a person's brain and neural network have formed. And this is how they process the world. This is how they take information in and then deal with that information in applicable ways. That is not something that needs to be treated and resolved. It is something that needs to be learned about, so that those people who do not understand an autistic individual people need to learn what makes them different. People need to learn what creates the differences that they experience. It's on the normal people to learn and to accept autistic people. People with autism do not deserve to be demonized as mentally ill. People who experience autistic traits do not need to be segmented out. And that's why I use the quotes. Normal. I like to say normies, because they think that they are the standard. They think that they are the measuring rod by which everyone else should be measured. And the reality is that no one meets the standard of normal. There are always outliers. There are always people who mask so that they can get by. There are always people who do what they can just to fit in. When I talk about people who experience autistic traits, they are normal. They are normal. There is no standard that they need to meet. There is no, there's no bar that they have to be able to get over. Any bars to an autistic person living their lives is basically just treating them as a disabled individual who doesn't have access to something. And let's not even get into disabilities and the way that our society handles individuals with different ability is horrendous. We don't have access for people with mobility challenges. We don't have access for people with sensory obstacles. We don't include those people in the wider society because the wider society considers themselves to be the standard and they create the barriers. The onus is on society to learn that not everyone is alike, and that there are some people who have different abilities. There are some people who perceive the world and process the world differently, and there are some people who do experience things like gender differently. For a attorney general to create a diagnostic criteria that says that an individual has to have a screening, and it says a comprehensive screening. I don't know if you all understand what goes into a comprehensive autism screening, but it is financially not feasible. It is hard to access that because there are not enough psychotherapists who can perform that procedure to make that a reality. If the state is wanting people to have a thorough, comprehensive screening for autism, then it falls to the state to pay for those things. It is also on the state to provide access to those things. But to go along and say that autism is a comorbidity with gender dysphoria is basically creating a barrier to gender affirming care, because in this moment the access to gender affirming care is based upon whether or not those comorbidities have been treated and resolved. That brings us to Ohio House Bill 68. This is actually written into a House bill. It says, no mental health professional shall diagnose or treat a minor individual who presents for the diagnosis or treatment of a gender-related condition without first doing both of the following. Notwithstanding Section 5122.04 of the Revised Code, obtaining the consent of a minor individual's residential parent and legal custodian or the minor individual's guardian. And 2, screening the minor individual for both of the following: other comorbidities that may be influencing the minor individual's gender-related condition, including depression, anxiety, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and other mental health conditions, and physical, sexual, mental, and emotional abuse and other traumas. Now, this is proof that what they are doing actually is going back to older criteria for gender identity disorder and transsexualism to find some sort of influence into why gender dysphoria presents itself. And what they are saying is that conditions such as depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, other mental health conditions are internal, and then physical, sexual, mental, emotional abuse, or other trauma is external. Now, it has been dismissed within the mental health community that trauma is a precursor to gender dysphoria. That has been thrown out. That has been tossed out, and saying that is not that is not anything that leads to gender dysphoria. And again, they are talking about issues such as ADHD and autism as comorbidities of gender dysphoria. As was stated in 2015, the language of autism spectrum disorder and gender dysphoria is that they are co-occurring. They occur at certain rates that is recognizable. They occur in such a way so that there is some form of connection between the two. But there is not a pathologizing connection between the two. That has not been established within the science. It has not been established at any point in any of the research that has been done. What they have found is that gender dysphoria and autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, these things happen in a significant number of the trans population. But it does not mean that they aren't the cause of one another, that they are not somehow pathological within the life of a gender dysphoric individual. Meaning that to claim that somebody has to be evaluated for those things prior to receiving gender affirming care, that those things must be treated and resolved before accessing gender affirming care is ludicrous. Because it is like this. Doctors have been using weight as a comorbidity. They have been using that as a barrier to accessing certain medical procedures. For example, both my father and my mother experienced similar degenerative disc issues. Both of them had to have the same surgical procedure. Yes. It's almost 11. Yes, it is. Okay. But the incident of those, my mother was told by a surgeon that he would not do the surgery because of her weight. My father, who had a similar body type, was not dismissed because of his weight. My mother had to find another surgeon to go in and have that surgery. Now, why is weight an issue? Because it was believed that the weight was causing the back issue, when the back issue was a degenerative disc disorder. It is a genetic disorder. So, I need to put this on pause. I got to make a road trip. I'm going to come back this afternoon, and we're going to talk about what this is leading to in terms of how this is going to play out in the coming years. So, come back and join me in about 3 hours, and we'll continue this conversation.